I'm Elise Labott, and this is the Us in the World Presidential Candidate Interview Series. We're sponsored by a coalition of leading nonprofit organizations, and we're asking the candidates their views on the challenges and opportunities facing the U.S. beyond our borders. I'm here with Andrew Yang. Mr. Yang, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Elise.
Now, the United States is the richest and most powerful nation. What, in your view, is the responsibility for the U.S. in the world?
Well, we're the biggest beneficiary of a world order that we helped establish over the past number of decades after World War II. But unfortunately, that order is now disintegrating, in part because our current president is an erratic and unpredictable leader who is calling into question even some of our longest standing commitments and treaties like NATO. So our role in the world is to help restore and maintain the world order that's been painfully built over the last number of decades and help bring more countries into the developed world as possible.
Now, the presidential budget request is really a statement of principles of the United States and American values. How would your budget reflect American values as far as the U.S. role in the world?
Well, you have to look at what we're spending money on right now. We're spending about $700 billion on our military. And a lot of that money is not truly making us safe. If you look at the biggest threats of the 21st century, they are not other countries. They're climate change, cybersecurity, infrastructure, and artificial intelligence, the proliferation of loose nuclear material. Like, these are some of the biggest threats of this era. And having another aircraft carrier floating around doesn't necessarily address climate change, as an example. So to me, we have to try and reprioritize what we're spending the money on, shifting some of this $700 billion in the military industrial complex over to domestic needs like infrastructure, but also to help mitigate climate change, not just here in the US, but around the world. And I think this administration has made a mistake by cutting foreign aid, which in the scheme of the federal budget is minuscule.
It's just about 1%.
It's about 1%. And there's a joke that this bank robber, Willie Sutton, told. He was like, "Why did you rob the bank?" Because that's where the money was. If you're looking to save money in the federal budget, you don't look at the 1% you're spending on foreign aid. You look at the hundreds of billions you're spending on the military industrial complex.
So you would increase foreign aid then?
I would, because if you look at it, you get a lot of bang for your buck when you put resources to work in some of these environments where a little goes a long way. And so if you can help maintain and strengthen societies in other parts of the world, that often will end up helping the U.S. national interest as well.
So you've talked about directing more of the federal budget from foreign pursuits to building infrastructure and other programs at home. How do you see the relationship between the U.S. role in the world and life here at home?
Well, to me, they're very much tied together, Elise. And so you could take it from the fact that if you don't have a sound society here at home, then you end up electing someone like Donald Trump, and then you have a very hard time projecting U.S. strength abroad. So to me, step number one is you have to have a society that's functioning at a high level here in the U.S. first. And we don't have that right now on a whole number of measurements and dimensions. We have record high levels of not just financial insecurity and depression and anxiety, but also even suicides and drug overdoses. It has gotten so bad that American life expectancy has declined for 3 years in a row, which is not something you ever see in a developed country. The last time that happened in the United States of America was the flu pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu. So think about that. You have to go back 100 years to find a time in American history where our life expectancy declined for 3 years in a row. You don't see that in a developed country traditionally. So step number one is we have to make ourselves strong and functional here at home.
To project power.
To be able to project power abroad. Because if you fall apart here, you wind up electing narcissist reality TV stars as your president, and then it's very, very hard to get anything done abroad.
So you've pledged to be very judicious and restrained about intervening in other countries' affairs. Under what circumstances would you use military force?
We have, at this point, been engaged in continuous armed conflict for the last 18 years. And that's not the way it's drawn up in the Constitution, and that's not the will of the American people. So I have a three-part test for sending our troops into harm's way. Number one, there needs to be a clear American national interest or the ability to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. So it needs to be an important reason to go. Number two, there needs to be a clearly defined time frame where it's not open-ended. You can look the troops in the eyes and say, you're going to be here for this long, and we can complete the mission and bring you home. Number three, we need to have partners and allies that are willing to join us in the mission. If these three things are in place, then I would actively consider military intervention.
So is it worth putting U.S. forces at risk when American values and the security of allies are on the line, but our direct security is not?
We are only as good as our word. If we have entered into a treaty to defend another country or ally, and then that country is threatened, then that to me is a very clear American national interest. Because if people don't believe in our word and our commitment, then it's going to be very, very hard to get anything done in any foreign theater.
So what would a U.S. military footprint look like in a Yang administration?
Well, to me, it's about getting smarter and not bigger. So if you look at, again, the list of major threats, climate change, infrastructure and artificial intelligence, loose nuclear material, that's not about having more military bases. That's about having a more responsive 21st century military footprint. So I would invest in cybersecurity and a cyber core. And you know what's funny is someone asked me yesterday, and they said, how would you feel about a cyber militia? Because it turns out that a lot of the leading experts on internet security don't work for the US government.
So what does a cyber militia look like? Like 20-year-olds in a basement or something?
Well, it's people like where you're crowd sourcing vulnerabilities. Like if you put up a system and say, hey, have at it and let us know what the vulnerabilities are, they'll actually be able to tell you. You know?
They'll have fun doing it.
Yeah, in a way that frankly would be superior to like if the government hired a consulting firm, military contractor. Like they just hire different pools of people. And for better or for worse, these loose hackers are much more analogous to the type of people you're worried about
right.
than the people in the giant corporate office.
So we've talked about what you think are the most major threats. What are the biggest crises facing the U.S. right now?
It begins with climate change, which is driving many of the problems around the world, where what's happening is that you have crop yields dropping and then conflict breaking out in various societies that's kicking off migrant crises that have even destabilized various democracies, where many societies are not able to properly welcome and acclimate large groups of refugees, and then there have been real issues politically as a result. So climate change means it's an existential threat to our way of life. I'm a parent, and I used to think that we were messing up the world for our grandkids, but now it's clear that we're messing up the world for ourselves and our kids. And that's going to destabilize things, unfortunately, in poorer parts of the world first, where if you think about a flood or a natural disaster, who suffers the most? It's always the poor who have
well,
less than
exactly.
resources.
So a lot of these poor, they're not necessarily contributing to it.
Oh, of course not.
But they also have to adapt to it. How do you make sure that climate policies aren't beneficial to just the rich who can afford these renewable energies, but you actually look at the world's poor who are affected?
I was just in New Hampshire, and they have buildings that are now flooding regularly. They have a shrimping business that went to zero. And if you look around the world, you have Pacific islands that are literally going underwater. And did that Pacific island contribute to global warming? Essentially zero. You know, it's like they didn't have a whole lot in the way of carbon emissions.
But they're still affected.
But they're still affected, and they're going underwater. So the goal has to be to have a global Marshall Plan to address climate change. Because the tough truth of it, Elise, is that the United States of America only accounts for 15% of global emissions. So even if we were to go net zero immediately like magic, the world would continue to warm. So if we're going to help the people on that Pacific island and the people in other developing countries that are going to be in some cases literally underwater, we have to get our arms around climate change, but we cannot do it alone. It's one reason why international cooperation is so vital in this era, because we can't solve the biggest problems alone.
So how would you use U.S. foreign assistance, and you talk about climate diplomacy, to address these challenges?
So if the rest of the world accounts for 85% of carbon emissions, we have to be there at the table with them, trying to guide them toward more renewable sources of energy. And right now, China is exporting coal-burning power plants to Africa and other developing countries. They're showing up and saying, you need power? I've got a coal-burning power plant for you. And then what does the African country say?
Thank
Great,
you.
thank you, right.
Right.
They're just thrilled to have some power.
Yeah.
So the climate diplomacy we have to engage in is to be there at the table with the African government and say, hey, instead of the coal burning power plant, how about these solar panels? That's the kind of relationship we have to have with these developing countries to try and move them in the right direction.
Would you condition foreign aid on sound climate policies?
Well, I think we have to try and provide carrots to move people in the right direction. And so if you're going to put aid into people's hands, then you want to align their interests with ours.
So you've talked about, using military assistance for determining what needs to be done in terms of the climate. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, what we said before is that the poor are the people that suffer the most with the advent of climate change. And so to me, it's the military, yes, but it's also the aid policies. Putting more money into people's hands actually will help strengthen communities and make it so they can develop in the right direction. On the military front, the tough part is that we've gotten really bad at building through our military. And we've seen it in multiple theaters at this point. And so what we have to do is try and refashion our military expertise so that it would be better able to mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change, amp up the Army Corps of Engineers and our ability to literally build bridges, roads, help update infrastructure so that in the case of, let's say, higher water levels, that people don't feel a need to relocate.
So what are the one or two foreign policy changes you'd make on day one as president?
Well, the first thing is I would let our allies know that we're open for business, that we need to renew our partnerships and relationships that are fraying now, disintegrating because of Donald Trump. And our allies are looking up and saying, who do we talk to? There's been a massive level of tension between Korea and Japan, and traditionally we would have been there to mediate
Exactly.
that. But we are not there because the current administration doesn't have an interest. So now they're meeting in China. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to suggest that is not the way it should be, because we've historically been allies with both South Korea and Japan. So number one is let everyone know, look, we are back, our word is good, we're interested in helping rebuild our relationships for the long term. That's the big move number one.
So you talked a lot about AI and the automation challenges, but how do you think AI will affect diplomacy and warfare? Former Secretary of State Kissinger talks a lot about AI will be used to make decisions on diplomacy and warfare. How do you see it applying?
I see it a little bit differently, where right now the main applications of AI are in the commercial realm.
Right.
So people are taking massive levels of data and then refining how they're putting resources to work. And the leader in this is China, because they have more access to more data than we do, and their government is supplying billions of dollars in infrastructure. So what Kissinger is suggesting is that you'll have an AI sort of doing game theory and figuring out what kind of decision you're going to make.
Yeah, making decisions on warfare based on this AI data.
I am more concerned that you're going to use AI to be able to hack vulnerable systems and infrastructure, where AI actually is much easier to use offensively than defensively, and so it's going to make different systems very vulnerable.
Imagine it's 2030. What does the world look like in terms of AI, and how has your administration helped us get there?
In an ideal world, we don't have this arms race with China in particular. We start a world data organization where we set up standards and protocols analogous to the WTO for trade, where we've created international norms that China felt like it had to bend to in order to join and participate in the benefits. If we do the same thing for data and artificial intelligence, then the US, the EU, and Japan can start setting international norms and standards, and then China will look up and say, are we content to just have our own silo in terms of how we're using this data, or do we want to join the world community? That's the best way to bring them to the table and prevent what could be a new Cold War in data and AI between the US and China.
So we've discussed multiple threats that don't respond to traditional security policies of climate change. I want to talk about some of the others, like nuclear proliferation, rising authoritarianism, and the misuse of this technology. How would you reduce those risks to Americans and people everywhere?
Well, this is where foreign aid comes in, because the less stable a society is, then the more you have to worry about extremist groups and non-state actors that are trying to get their hands on loose nuclear material and other things that will help destabilize world security. So if you have, for example, I mean, closest to home, you have various groups in Latin America. Unfortunately, there are several states right here in our backyard that are starting to become unstable and are sending migrants heading north to us. This is one reason why various candidates, including me, have been saying, look, if we send aid to these countries, it's going to help keep them whole. And then if those societies are whole, then you have to worry less about extremist groups who are trying to do us harm and get a hold of things like loose nuclear material.
So it sounds like you're saying prioritize aid as preventionary, and that's how you build sustainable peace and conflict.
Yeah, it's a little bit like preventative care. You know what I mean? Like right now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to wait until the patient's sick and ready for the hospital, because it's very, very hard to get them back on their feet at that point. What you want to do is you want to have them be healthy the whole time. And that's the way I see foreign aid to various societies, that it's much easier to maintain a healthy society or maintain a healthy world order than it is to rebuild it after it has collapsed or fallen ill.
What about those in extreme poverty? I mean, you've talked very eloquently about, entrepreneur and helping build, create growth in society. How do you kind of do the balance between creating dynamic societies and still lifting up those 1 in 10 that live in extreme poverty?
I think the answer to extreme poverty is really straightforward, Elise. Give them money, truly. And this is something that I feel is the future of a lot of foreign aid, where if you look at different aid programs, when you put money into people's hands, it benefits women most of all. Women go to school at higher levels, women start businesses at higher levels. Whereas if you funnel the aid to something concrete, like books or nutrition or mosquito nets or wells or toys or computers or any of these things, a lot of them end up being less useful to these communities than straight cash, which they'll use to start cottage businesses in their own home. And the reason I love aid to places that are very, very poor is that it doesn't even take that much money to be transformative in many of these communities. There's an organization called Give Directly that's demonstrated this very powerfully, where they put relatively small amounts of money into people's hands, and then all of a sudden you see women's health and nutrition go up, rates of business formation go up, kids and girls going to school go up. It's very, very powerful.
So you've talked about the need to prevent companies from working with authoritarian regimes or repressive regimes and giving them technology to do so. And you have talked about criminal and civil penalties for US companies. Tell us about that.
Well, unfortunately, we're at a point now where everything revolves around the almighty dollar in our society. And if there's a company that feels like it can profit to the tune of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars and then pay a fine, they'll do it, And we saw that very clearly with the opiate crisis, the opiate epidemic, where Purdue Pharma paid a fine of $600 million, which sounds like a lot, until you realize they made $30 billion. And now 8 Americans are dying of drug overdoses every hour. So the only way you can try and keep these companies from not profiting at the expense of our people is to say, look, they're going to be beyond just these fines, where you're doing a cost-benefit calculation and saying, it's worth it, like I could pay that fine, we'll still be rich. Instead, you have to say, look, there's personal culpability for this, that if you're the CEO or primary shareholder of a company that's done something unconscionable, then you're going to pay a price personally.
You've spoken very passionately about the need to bring high-skilled immigrants here to the US, or keep students that are learning valuable skills. But what about the idea that America was founded on the premise that you could come here with nothing and you could still build something of yourself? How do you square that?
I don't think it's an either or, truly. I think that...
Because your father was an immigrant, lived on a peanut farm, and came here and really made something of himself.
I'm certainly very proud of my dad and my mom. And my dad did grow up on a peanut farm in Asia with no floor. I saw it as a teenager, and I was like, this is where you grew up? Looking around. I must have seemed so American, because I was like walking around, I was like 18 or 19 years old, and whatever American teenagers were wearing then. But I saw the peanut farm, and I was like, no way. So he grew up on that peanut farm in Taiwan, and then he got his physics degree in Taiwan initially, but then he came over to the States for his graduate degree. He got his doctorate, and there he met my mom. So you're right that I'm very passionate about the fact that we need to be trying to attract talented immigrants from around the world to try and create lives for themselves here, because that's what happened with my brother and me.
But you don't think there should be a litmus test, do you?
But I also believe that there's a place in this country for people at every educational level, and that people who are coming here to create a better life. You know, one story I like to tell. One of the founders of Google came here on a family visa. It was not like a, it's like a family reunification. So you don't need to just serve one goal. You can serve multiple goals with a modern immigration policy.
What about our responsibility to refugees? You know, what is our responsibility? The Obama administration had about 110,000 as an average. Now the presidential determination under Trump administration is like 30,000.
Yeah.
What do you think is about the right number?
I think restoring it to the Obama era levels is the right move. And even that level, and you know this, Elise, is relatively low compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Like as a proportion of our own population, we're a country of 320 million plus. Like being able to acclimate 110,000 refugees a year is very reasonable.
Let's talk about LGBTQ issues. As president, how would you help protect those populations internationally? You've talked a lot about putting them in your cabinet and programs here, but abroad.
Well, this is one reason why it's so important for us to maintain an international world order, where if a country adheres to values that we hold very dear, then they feel like they're going to win through that, where we can put soft pressure on other countries through a combination of both carrots primarily, but then a few sticks too, where if they are abusive of ethnic minorities or LGBTQ community members, then they feel like, oh, there's a price to be paid for that. Right now, it's unclear what that price would be in many contexts, and it's making us less able to push our values to other parts of the world.
And what about women? How do you see promoting the rights and status of women and girls, including economic empowerment?
One, again, is trying to maintain international norms. That helps women, it helps journalists, as another example, and you've been in foreign theater, so you have this sense. But to me, the best way you can empower women is by trying to lift them out of poverty, getting them in a position where they can control their own future, go to school, get educated, start businesses, and they have economic independence from the men in their societies. It's one reason why I'm so passionate about a universal basic income, not just here in the US, but internationally. There was a joke someone said to me where they were like, I would be even more for universal basic income if only women got it.
Me too.
Well, because the fact is, when you think about the use of these proceeds, you instinctively think that women in a developing country would do great things with it, which is correct. They do great things with it. And that if you're worried about someone doing something not so great, it's like the guys. But I'm happy to say even the guys don't do anything bad with it. Like you don't see any increases in substance abuse or decrease in work level, the rest of it. But we know that the women do awesome things with it, yeah.
Right. Okay, I have one more question and then we're going to get to a couple fun questions.
Fun.
So you've said that Russia is the biggest geopolitical threat, particularly because of the hacking,
because of their current hacking of our democracy,
election interference. But why not China? I mean, you've talked about that being the number one relationship to reset, but U.S. intelligence agencies have identified China as the number one threat.
If you look at who our biggest rival is going to be over time, it's definitely China, not Russia.
Yeah.
I would identify Russia as the most immediate threat because they're literally hacking our democracy from underneath our feet. We're about to vote again next year, and Americans are not even sure if their votes will be counted and if our democracy is secure. It's very hard to solve big problems if you can't get that right. So to me, Russia is the most immediate problem and threat, and it's actively working to undermine us. But bigger picture, it's China on artificial intelligence, it's China economically and militarily.
But you think working with them rather than kind of being an adversary is the way to go?
Well, you need, again, a combination of carrots and sticks, but I would suggest that it's going to be very, very hard to make progress on climate change or artificial intelligence or North Korea or a lot of other things if we have purely adversarial relationships with China.
Okay, lightning round of a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap it up. As president, which world leader would you welcome to the White House first, and why?
I would say Trudeau in Canada because they're our closest neighbor and ally, and it just seems neighborly.
Which country would you visit first, and why?
Again, the first thing that came to mind for me is Canada or Mexico, because again, I feel like we have the tightest trade relationships with them. But after that, it would be one of our historic allies in the UK.
What's your favorite band?
The Cure. Hope that's cool for everyone.
It's cool for me.
If it's cool for you, Elise, then it must be cool. Kids, if you don't know who The Cure
is very cool.
They're very, very cool. They sang Just Like Heaven, which you like. What else?
Might sing a few bars after. What's the first concert you went to?
Oh my gosh, I love it so much. I went to Depeche Mode in
Okay.
1989. It's,
Long hair?
The Violator tour. My hair wasn't that long.
What's your favorite food to cook?
Well, it's not a very long list because I'm a terrible cook. So it would be spaghetti, like pasta and meat sauce. Pretty boring. Sorry, ladies. No, I'm kidding. My wife definitely did not marry me for my cooking. If she had, she just would have like jogged the other direction.
What are you reading?
Immediately.
What are you reading right now?
I do a lot of nonfiction reading and policy briefs. The last book on my shelf was AI Superpowers, very apropos, by Kai-Fu Lee about China's advantages in artificial intelligence. Pretty exciting stuff, huh? That's what you read.
It's on Amazon. Tell us a fun fact about yourself that nobody knows.
My brother and I can speak in unison. So as kids, we used to do really stupid skits together. It'd be like, what? There's only one of us. Are you sure you're not seeing double? Is so dumb.
If you could meet anyone in the world, live or deceased, who would it be?
Live or deceased? You definitely have to choose someone dead then, because live you could get.
There's still a chance.
Yeah, live you can get in real life. Abraham Lincoln, because I feel like he brought the country together in the most dramatic way possible.
Well, Andrew Yang, thank you so much for joining us for the Us in the World presidential interview series. Good luck, and thank you very much for joining us.
Team, subscribe for more of these type of videos.